Hey, this is Gina Grad.
Hi, this is Teresa Strasser.
Hi, everyone. This is Mike Errico.
Hey there, this is Casey Cavalier.
I'm Rocky Rose.
And you are listening to The Jay Franzi Show.
Lucky you.
Welcome to The Jay Franzi Show, a behind-the-curtain look at the entertainment industry with insights you can't pay for and stories you've never heard. Now, here's your host, Jay Franzi.
Well, hello and welcome to the show. I am Jay Franzi, and this is your backstage pass to the entertainment industry. This week, we get to talk with an author who used to be an agent for the CIA. We get to talk with Robert Schreiner. We'll talk to him about the inspiration for his new book, The Wolves and the Greyhounds. We'll talk about his production process, and we'll discuss his time as an agent in the CIA. Now, I met Bob several years ago working in security. We've remained close friends ever since, and I can't wait to talk with him tonight. So, if you would like to join in, comment, or fire off any questions, please head over to jfranzi.com. Now, let's get started. Robert, sir, Bob, my friend, how are you?
Doing well. Thank you very much for having me on.
It is my absolute pleasure. I am so happy to have you here. So if you don't mind, let's just start with the idea, the concept. How long ago did you start working on the book?
The first concept was not even a book idea, really. It was generated from, believe it or not, our children's high school history teacher.
Oh, really?
Our kids are now 29, 30, 31 years old. So this was, at least 15 some years ago. They all went to the same high school, and they're all about a year apart in age. And their high school history teacher, shout out to Robert Thompson at El Camino High School in Sacramento, he had this project that he had all of his students do, which was to write a journal as if they were participating in some fashion, however they wanted to choose it, in the First World War. And he did that because the First World War often gets sort of short shrift when we're thinking about 20th century history, and more often than not, the Second World War gets much more kind of press and a lot more notice and notoriety. But the First World War really set the stage for the Second World War, and it created a lot of the geopolitical circumstances that even we see today. And so it's that important that he wanted all of his students to do that. So 3 years in a row, all of our kids had this project that they had to do. And I've been an amateur military historian as a hobby for years, since I was a kid.
How do you get into that in the first place?
Well, I grew up as a foreign service brat overseas, and my dad was assigned to posts in Europe and in Asia, and so I grew up. On our vacations, we would go to places that had castles and battlefields, and so I just got this had this fascination from it from a young age. So there's pictures of me as a 6-year-old standing in a battlement in a castle in Spain, that kind of thing. So
we'll put those in the show notes.
Yeah, I wish I had brought those along. So yes, I'm a military history nerd, and I had a bunch of books about this. Just previous life, I was a military analyst. So all of our kids went through this project, and I would just kind of feed them information so that they could, do some research. And I gave them books, and I was looking through some of these books as part of this process. And in one of the books, this one bullet, very brief paragraph that happened to mention the Battle of Coronel. And even as a military history nerd, I had not heard of the Battle of Coronel. And I read about it, the backstory, and I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. Came back to it again, maybe a year later, and looked at it some more. And the more I looked at it, the more I read about it, the more I was fascinated by this amazing story that actually happened in the first months of the First World War. Well, the kids didn't actually use that as part of their project. They went on, did their thing, graduated from high school. This idea was still knocking around in the back of my head about this amazing story from the First World War. And years later, I actually decided to research it a little bit more. And I found some old books, some from the 1930s and 20s, 1940s and 50s, long out of print. And I ordered them off of Amazon and eBay and wherever I could find them, and read up even more about this story. And at that point, I became convinced that turning this story into a novel would be an amazing idea. And so I then began to do some serious research, and I really began that process. And the research itself took me several years. I think before I wrote a single word of the book, I probably researched for like 3 years. I mean, I got information from the Royal Naval College in London, the Wiltshire Archaeological Society in England, Stanford University, UCLA. I mean, all kinds of places that I got information from that had been sort of squirreled away for years. And there had been some other books written about this, but most of them were very old, and a lot of people had never even heard of these stories. So that was the genesis of this, was that, that sort of nagging idea from our kids' old high school projects that turned into this book idea several years later.
Well, let me stop there for a second. The 3 years of research, did you know you were researching for a book, or was this just part of the hobby?
No, at that point I had decided I'd like to write a book about this. And so I then got really serious about the research and decided that I wanted to find out as much as I could about the story behind this story. What were the motivating factors behind these kind of amazing people that were involved in these events? And so I really was very serious about writing a book at that point, but wanted to become an expert. I mean, the adage is write what you know. Well, of course, no one living today was a naval officer in World War I. And so in order to do that effectively, I really felt I needed to become an expert in the field. And so I did this kind of astonishing amount of research, which involved some travel and a lot of long hours reading and making notes and outlining for years, with the idea that I would, in fact, turn this into a book.
All right. Well, that's pretty cool. I mean, is that an educational path that you ever decided to take?
I've always been interested in writing, yes. And so as a kid, I wrote short stories, and I've written a novella when I was in high school. I had, just dabbled in it. I had at one point years ago, more than 25 years ago, I would say at this point, I did try to start a novel, sort of a science fiction type of novel. And none of it really kind of stuck. And but it's been something that I've been interested in for a long time and enjoy writing for sure.
Did it not stick because it just didn't resonate with you like this does?
Yeah, I think that was part of it. I think that I hadn't fleshed out the concept enough to be able to pursue it. By the time that I had completed the research for this book, I had much of it written in my head already. I pretty much knew how I wanted the story arc to go, how much of the real events I was going to hew towards, and some of it I would have to maybe depart a little bit for narrative flow. And I wanted to actually focus on certain characters that were based on real people because of their circumstances. And there were certain parts of it that I found particularly inspiring and heroic. And I thought, well, these would make for some excellent protagonists in this tale.
So you come up with this idea and you want to put the book together. What's your next step?
It was actually just kind of sitting down to write it. I at that point, I had done so much research. I was actually almost antsy. I had all of this information in my head. I had, from almost nothing, made myself an expert in this really obscure segment of military history. And at that point, I was just really, really eager to get going. And so I just started writing. And I had an idea at this point where I wanted the story to start. And I just started throwing words on a page. And at the time, this is maybe part of the fate that intervened here. I had actually been laid off from a job. And the company that I had been working for had been downsizing. It was during the recession. And they were laying off all kinds of folks. So I was on their, like the third round of layoffs. And at that point, I found myself between jobs, and I was looking for new work, and I had all this extra time. So I would spend the first couple hours of every day job hunting, looking for jobs and making calls and sending out emails and, revising the resume and doing all those things that you need to do when you're searching for a job. And then with the rest of the day, you can bang your head against a wall only so much. The rest of the day, I would write, and I would just dig into it. And I have to admit, my wife was a little concerned about the balance there, that couple hours of the job hunt and, 6 hours and 7 hours of writing this book. And she's like, really? I said, honey, I've done all of this. I've sent, 73 applications out this morning. This is as much as I can do. So that's what I did. I just threw myself into it. And I had several months of this underemployment where I was, did some, freelance jobs and some other things in the meantime, where I was able to write a huge chunk of this book as it turned out.
You're approaching the writing part before you ever approach any of the technical stuff of finding a publisher and getting it in the proper layout and stuff. So did you finish the entire writing process before you approached the technical side?
Absolutely. In fact, I finished the book and then realized that I had written a massive doorstop of a book. I had written a book that was vastly too large to ever get published. So then it became the phase 2 of the writing process, which was to go back and realize, okay, I've crammed a whole lot of stuff into this book because I loved all of it, and I loved the writing, and I loved this process, and it was so much fun to do. And I realized, but wait a minute, nobody else cares this much about this subject as I do. And I've probably got a whole bunch of stuff in here that doesn't push forward the narrative flow of this book. So then I spent what I would say is probably another couple of years, just kind of playing around with that initial draft. I did have some friends and family kind of read through it, give me some ideas and pointers about where I was potentially going astray. And I was able to cut that initial draft down by about a third to get it into what is a reasonable book length. The paperback version of this book is 490 pages, which is, it's a larger than average book, but it's certainly not a massive, huge, War and Peace kind of a thing. So that definitely was the next step, was to go back through it and create something that I thought would actually be publishable. And so I did that. I had folks, copy edit it and, kind of go through it. Another pair of eyes is always a good thing, or another, several pairs of eyes to actually look at it, because you can read the same passage a dozen times and still skip over a very glaring typo in the book, because I know what it's supposed to say. The fact that I didn't write it that way is sort of an annoying detail. So I did all of that stuff, got it to the point where it really was, I thought, publisher ready. And at that point it was, okay, well, what do I do next? How do I find a publisher? How do I do all that? And I then researched all of that. And the next step is, you can't just reach out to a publisher and say, hey, I've got a book. When do we start? It doesn't work that way. And so I was researching literary agents, who then represent authors towards publishers. So
what was that process like?
That's a grueling, terrible process, honestly. It is just awful, because essentially what you're doing is you're trying to find someone who not only can you convince them to be passionate about something that you're obviously passionate about, but who also then is willing to, take a risk professionally, represent you to someone else, and also thinks that what you have done is saleable, that they can actually pitch this to a publisher who's then going to be willing to publish it. So essentially what I was setting myself up for was months and months and months of just a drumbeat of rejection. And that's really what happened. So I went through, I think, 3 different rounds of reaching out to publishers and agents. I did reach out to some small publishers. There are some publishers where you can reach out to them directly and they'll accept queries, just essentially cold from a writer. And so I found a whole bunch of them as well. So over a period, I would say maybe 3 years, I then was just trying to get this published and sending out query letters and waiting for them to take a look at it. I had lots of responses from agents who were interested, who read the manuscript, who asked for the manuscript. And that's always a big step. It's not often that an agent will actually request the manuscript to read the whole thing. Normally you send a small snippet, the first 5 to 50 pages or something, as well as a synopsis. And then they sort of decide more or less on the fly whether or not they're interested enough to request more. And so I had probably 10 or 12 requests over that period of time for the entire manuscript, had a lot of very positive comments. And that's what kind of kept me going, even though it was a string of rejections, was that had I been getting responses from agents who said, wow, hey, you might want to take a writing class, or, this is really great, but don't bother us ever again. It wasn't like that. Instead, the responses I was getting were, wow, I really like this. This is amazing. It's well written. You've got a unique story here. I just don't know if I can sell it to a publisher because there's nothing like it on the market. And of course, that's part of it's the kind of catch-22 of this, is that there has to be something sort of like it, right? And there isn't anything quite like this. There aren't a whole lot of novels about World War I naval combat. Well, it's a military thriller. It isn't that exotic. It just happens to take place in the First World War. So that was that was the tough part, is I was getting all of this positive feedback from people who liked it, were requesting it, but none of it went any farther than that. We can't find a publisher for it. We can't, actually sell it. So sorry about that. Hey, was really, hoping that we could do something with this, but it's just not going to go anywhere. And so I did that for, as I said, more than 3 years. I was in this process. I had a book. It was essentially done, but couldn't find a place for it to be published. And that was really frustrating and discouraging. It was, that was rough. Because at that point, I'm like, okay, wow, I just spent the last several years of my life doing something that was just a monstrous waste of time.
Did it make you want to give up?
At times, yes. At times. And there were times where I really was just, so discouraged that it's like, and I love writing. And it discouraged me enough that, there were several other book ideas that were kind of in the queue in my brain that I wanted to write. But because this one was such a roadblock, it really was affecting my inspiration to write anymore. And so that was, it was very discouraging. And so that was tough.
So you spent 3 years researching, then you spent a couple years anyway writing,
right?
And then you spent 3 years trying to shop for, small publishers or an agent. And I'm assuming that you decided not to go with an agent.
Ultimately, yes. I decided I was sort of at my wit's end at this point. I had what I thought had sort of exhausted the pool of agents who might represent. I had sent this out to at least 75, probably between 75 and 80 different agents during this period of time, and probably 20 or more small publishers. And these were all the folks that I could find in the industry who might actually represent or publish this kind of book, because every publisher, every agent has sort of a genre or range of genres that they're interested in, and only that narrow kind of focus. So there were certainly, potentially other agents out there, but I had already done some triage in this process and focused on the likely targets. And I thought, well, if these folks aren't interested, I'm sure that the other folks aren't going to be interested.
Well, you're picking 80. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, it doesn't sound like a big number when you're throwing out, several hundred resumes a day. But when you're talking about agents for a book, 80 is a lot of people. Did you get responses from all 80?
I got responses probably from 60 of the 80, I would say, over that period of time. There were some that were just dead air and we didn't get any kind of response at all.
It's a better return than your resumes.
Yeah, exactly. And I probably heard from about 60 of the 80 agents, and I heard from probably of the 20 or so publishers, I probably heard from maybe 15 of those. So, still a majority of them. And again, I got very complimentary and very polite responses. Nothing was, hey, go, don't quit your day job kind of a thing. It was all very positive. And that was sort of this, small little flame that kept burning, that kept me going, that I wasn't going to entirely give up, because I knew that people who know books, who had read this book at this point, and beyond my inner circle of friends and family and other fellow writers that I knew personally, who are likely to be biased in my favor, these folks that I had sent it out to, who had actually read the manuscript, who were very positive about it, these are people who read books, and that's what they do for a living. And so the fact that I was getting positive feedback from them, even though they then couldn't figure out a way to sell this book, was inspirational to me, and encouraging to me to move on, to keep going.
Yeah, so that keeps you going. When did things change, and how did they change for you?
They only changed when I just got so frustrated with it that I much more seriously looked into self-publishing. And I had considered, and I think this was a mental block on my own part, I was aware of self-publishing certainly during this entire process. My father had written a couple of books. He'd written a family memoir, and he'd written a wine book. He was a wine enthusiast. And he had self-published both of those books. And in fact, I'd actually helped him. I'd helped edit those books for him. And so I was aware of the process. And I certainly, was familiar with, how much of it worked. But on some level, and this is, entirely my fault mentally, I had sort of looked upon the self-publishing side as sort of giving up. Like as this idea that, okay, if I can't get this traditionally published, then I'm somehow giving up on this process. And I didn't want to do that. And I was very stubborn about it. I just, I've got to just keep at this. And I'm getting these positive responses. All it takes is one of these people to say yes. Well, none of them said yes. So I then hit this wall and thought, okay, this is my only option. And so I then reluctantly started researching the current state of self-publishing in the world, and found that not only is it a very robust industry unto itself, but that there are amazing tools out there that are very helpful to first-time authors and even repeat authors. There are a number of very successful self-published authors who have written 15 or more books, and they're just still cranking them out. They're doing very well. In many cases, that's now their full-time job. They don't have another job. They are actually full-time professional writers, and they're doing it through self-publishing. So then it became this new research project for me, is to learn as much about the self-publishing part of this world as I could, to bring myself up to speed with all the latest and greatest. It had been, a number of years since I had helped my father with his books, and a lot had changed in that period of time. And so that was the next thing, is researching all of that so that I could do it as effectively as possible, and figure out all the tools and the tricks and the ways to, how to do it, how not to do it. And that was the next phase.
Well, self-publishing, and I talk to people and try to explain it like this. I spent the majority of my time in the music industry, and the publishing companies are similar to what a record label is in the music world. And these days, you don't need the record label, just like you don't need the publisher, because all they are is a bank. They have the funds and the means to get you to your destination. So if you have that on your own and you have the ability to make those right steps, you don't need that bank. You don't need their resources. So who did the editing for your book?
I actually had a couple people who were competent editors that I just happen to know, that I could actually rely on. Now, there are resources to do that. And I did consider, like, one of the really good resources for self-published authors is Reedsy, reedsy.com. And they have a huge stable of people who are proofreaders and editors and cover designers, and a lot of folks who are in this industry. And so I had contemplated doing that, but I ultimately, because I had some resources of folks who were able to do this for me, I didn't go to Reedsy for this particular task, but I was able to get it edited in that fashion. So that's how I did in this case.
So that's a perfect point. So you write the book, you do the research, you write the book, and then you hire an editor, whether it's somebody you already knew or you go through a service. And then there's the assembly of the book. So who did you use to assemble it?
I actually did that myself.
Okay, so I'm guessing that took more research.
Well, it took some research. Now, in this particular case, I had the advantage of having done this for my father, like 15 or 20 years earlier. And so I was reasonably familiar with basic layout and gutters and margins and print quality and all that stuff. And so I still had that knowledge and information. Now, the technology had changed in 20 years. The software was different. So what I did was I looked at the publishing venues that were the most common ones. In this particular case, it would be Amazon is one of the preeminent ones. Ingram Spark is another one. Draft Digital. There's several of them that are out there that will take your book and publish it. And I looked at their requirements, and I essentially mirrored the software, all of that setup to match what they required. And so in this particular case, I set it up myself, and I knew enough about it to be able to do that. But again, there are lots of resources available to do that. Not only is there software where you can do it yourself, but again, there are folks in the writing and writing help community who have lots of knowledge. They've laid out hundreds of books. They know exactly how to do it. And so that was, and I certainly did lean on some of those resources online and made sure that I wasn't going astray. But in this particular case, I had some of that knowledge myself. So I boldly took on the task of laying out a 400 some page book, which ultimately turned out pretty good. But there were a few things along the way that it was mostly software that I had to, kind of hurdles that I had to get over, but that I was able to figure out.
What software did you use?
Well, I used to lay out the book. I'd already written it in Word, and so I just laid it out in Microsoft Word. But there are other software packages out there that are designed specifically for book layouts, and I did cross-check in some of those, and I actually brought them up because I actually laid out two versions of the book, one for the paperback version and one for the ebook, because they are different in how you lay them out. So I was able to use some other software to do that. On the Amazon side, there is as far as the Kindle Direct Publishing world, there is a software that they provide. It's actually free. You can just download it. And that will actually allow you to lay out a book in, so I took the Word version. It allows you to lay out in an ebook format. And there's several others that you can, there's quite a few of them that are out there that are various levels of kind of user friendliness that you can use. And it really depends on what your goal is. In fact, some like Draft Digital has its own book editor that allows you to create ebooks and create, custom like chapter headings and all kinds of things. I did try that. I did kind of a cross check with the Draft Digital one. I kind of liked the result that I got on Amazon better. And so I ended up using that one for the ebook.
Okay. So let's talk graphics now. How did you come up with the graphics for the book?
I actually went out to Reedsy, so Reedsy.com. They have all of these cover designers on that. It's essentially it's a forum where you can put out your project and you can essentially explain what it is you're doing, the type of book you're writing. You can actually put in some examples of things of other books that, like covers that you think are sort of in the same genre that you'd like to do. Put it out there, and then you get bids from folks who are interested in actually bidding on the work. And you can choose, you can look at their portfolio, see what they've done. And so that's what I did. I actually put it out there. I had set aside a portion of my self-publishing budget to get the cover professionally designed. And I then reached out to these folks, got a bunch of bids, and I picked the designer that seemed to have the best vision, had done some things in sort of the military thriller kind of genre, and was, I thought, pretty competent in doing that. I also, fortunately, as part of my research over those years, I had assembled a digital library of thousands of images that I had come across, just so I could have, I needed to know all of the, for example, all of the warships of the period, all of the guns that they used, all of the ammunition and propellants, and all of the things, the uniforms that the officers wore. I had pictures of everything you can imagine. There are surviving photos of some of the actual participants in the battles that happened in this book. Some of the participants, the actual captains and admirals, some of the civilians who were involved. And so I had assembled all of this, and I'd come across a whole bunch of pictures, old, grainy photographs, some paintings that actually were part of this. And the image that is the background image on this for the book actually was from a postcard that was printed in Germany in 1914 that commemorated one of these battles. And it actually is available as a stock image that you can license for use like this. And so I provided a whole bunch of these images, this one as well as a whole bunch of other ones, to this designer. And he and I then worked through the process of coming up with concepts, and we whittled it down to kind of the top three. We tweaked it a little bit, and this was the final result. And it turned out really good. I really liked, the color scheme, and the designer did a great job with the typography. That was a fun part of this process that didn't involve me writing a single word, really. I did have to write the blurb on the back of the paperback, but other than that, it was fun to be on the design side of it for a little bit.
Well, that's good that you mentioned that. But before we get to the blurb on the back, as far as the cover goes, you said you had the opportunity to work with them and throw ideas back and forth, which is something we don't always get. A lot of times we just give an idea, and they might come with 2 or 3 options, but we don't get to go back and forth. So you're able to go back and forth and really narrow down what you like.
Absolutely.
Did you have the same opportunity with the text?
Yes. No. In fact, I had worked, kind of wordsmithed the text for the back, and this particular designer had designed hundreds and hundreds of book covers before, and so it was good to be able to bounce some ideas off of him and essentially say, okay, what's kind of maximum word count here? What's a good, we want some negative space in this. We don't want it to just be a big clod of text on the back. And then we also talked about how that would work with wrapping this image around to the back of the book. We don't get that on the ebook version. You only get the front of it on the ebook version. But it's this really kind of cool seascape with the smoke and all of that. And so the back then gets darker as it goes around. And so we were able to offset the text and get some complementary colors, and that was fun. It was a good experience to be able to work with him. And I think that I think the designer kind of got caught up in it. He really wanted this to turn out as well, and that was nice to have someone who was invested as well.
Which is cool. I mean, that's when you get the best work. And from their point of view, you have to allow them to have that leeway to experiment and try things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And he provided a whole bunch of really neat ideas, and it was actually kind of a shame that I wasn't able to use all of them. We ended up with a product that I think really works well, but some of the ones that ended up being discarded, those were great ideas as well. So it's it was nice to see that there was more than just this one option that we could have gone with.
Let's talk about the copy on the blurb on the back. You said you wrote it yourself. So is it just a summary or a glimpse of what the book is about?
It's a little bit of a summary. Of course, the back of a book is really designed as marketing copy. And so the idea is that if someone were to be walking by and see this on a bookshelf in a bookstore, the cover might do the first part of the job and kind of grab their attention. Then they pick it up, and the next thing they do is turn it over to the back. And so what's this really about? And so, yes, it summarizes some of the events, but it really only summarizes the beginning of the story just to draw the reader in, and mentions the historical backdrop to these events, and mentions the 2 protagonists in the story. There's a captain on the British side and a captain on the German side, and those are our protagonists in the novel. And so I wanted the blurb to give a little bit of a backstory, intrigue the reader, and give them an idea of who they'd be investing their time in with these 2 protagonists.
Well, the reason I even asked that is because, like you said, the back is marketing material, and I know on the back of my books, the blurbs are written by somebody else, and there's somebody else that had a bigger name than I do in order to add some credibility to my work. So I didn't know if you considered going that route for a book like this.
And you can absolutely. There are people who specialize in doing that. In fact, one of the things that surprised me that I didn't realize, but I probably should have, with everything else going in the direction of AI these days, there are actually AI tools that you can feed in a certain amount of information and it will spit out a very AI-like book blurb for you. You know how AI doesn't get people's features quite right. Well, the AI versions of this, I did it a couple times to see what it would come up with.
Very flowery.
Oh, it was just so wooden, and it was like, okay, we can't go with this. So no, I wrote it myself, and I went through several iterations of it, and I had a few other people read it and say, just to see, as a sanity check. I'm certainly not an expert, as you note. There are people whose jobs it is just to write book blurbs, like there are people who write ad copy, and that's what they do for a living. And certainly not my area of expertise, but I knew it well enough to think, okay, well, if I were the one wandering by this bookshelf in a bookstore, what would it take to intrigue me to pick this book up if I knew nothing about the subject? And so that's what I tried to do there. And so I went through several iterations of it and had a few other people comment on it. And that's why I settled on this, the final version.
Well, you brought up AI, and AI is a great tool for some things. But did you use AI as a source of inspiration?
No. It was more a confirmation for me that AI is not ready for prime time when it comes to this kind of thing. It was like, wow, this at some point, I'm sure that AI will write symphonies and do all kinds of amazing things. But at this point, that technology is absolutely not there. And so it was more confirmation that this supposed tool that is working for, I don't know who, it's working for somebody, is not good enough for what I needed it to do. And that I was definitely more competent at this stage in the game than the AI was. And so it was more just a reality confirmation that this is not yet a mature enough part of this industry.
Well, AI came on big when ChatGPT came out,
right,
and people use that for everything. But I've seen it used pretty creatively. And I was talking to somebody earlier today about writing podcast descriptions and stuff like that. So, for example, we have our talk tonight. We can say, Bob's coming on the show. This is what we're going to talk about. And you list a few bullet points. And the more descriptive you are in the information you feed it, the better results you get back. But it's still, like you said, not ready for prime time. You get a lot of flowery language and words that most people aren't going to use, and it's just not really down to earth. But I noticed just recently, the hosting company that I use, they put in their own version of AI, which just runs off the ChatGPT model. I get it. But the prompts that are fed into their system does a pretty good job of analyzing show material. So, for example, it will go through and, I say listen, but it'll go through and analyze an entire episode and then tell you exactly what was spoken about and key talking points, and allows you to put it into your words so that way you don't have to go through and analyze the material. So I think as far as analyzing something, that saves a lot of time. Rather than listening to an hour-long episode or a 4-hour episode for some people, this will analyze it and tell you just what the key talking points are, and now you can go ahead and write the material yourself. So I didn't know if you dabbled in it enough to experiment with any of that stuff.
No, I hadn't gotten to it, but that makes me think that back in those days, the first years when I was researching it, it would have been helpful to have an AI bot scrub the internet and pull all those images for me and do all that stuff, which I was doing all manually. But
it saves you 3 years worth of research.
Exactly, it was rewarding, and I learned a lot. And
well, that's just it. You're not going to learn if you don't do the research yourself.
That's right.
My wife is finishing up her master's degree, and it's in history. And AI now available, so everybody in her school, in her class, they're making use of it. She refuses to touch it. She's like, I'm not even going to touch it. She doesn't want to tarnish her reputation or her grade and any of that stuff. And I get it. But there's so many things you can do with AI that doesn't require you to use it to write your material for you.
Right. Just use it as a labor-saving device.
Right. You can use it to analyze an article. Hey, read this article and tell me what the key point is, and it'll summarize it for you.
Yeah, well, one of the things I found in the research, I had mentioned that I had pulled these and found these old out-of-print books from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s about this subject. And these are all, nonfiction military history books written about, in most cases, former Royal Navy captains. In some cases, it was former Kaiserliche Marine captains for the German Navy who had written these stories about these events. And what I found fascinating by that was that all of the accounts were slightly different. There was no universal, historical truth to, even these accounts, some of them were written by people who actually participated in them. And even those conflicted. And so that was a fascinating part of this process where I was, reading, in some cases, firsthand accounts. I had ship's logs. I had, books written about people who actually were there. And they all conflicted in slight detail and sometimes motivation, and sometimes in very dramatic ways they were different. Because certainly in wartime, there are immense biases, not just political, but certainly nationalism and military outlook and circumstance all play a role. And so all of these various accounts were different in fascinating ways. And so I had to find my own path through those stories to figure out which part of it I wanted to tell, which parts I thought were more true, which things might resonate more with the reader, might provide a better narrative arc. And so I had these very interestingly different viewpoints from, again, people who actually were there.
What do you think is necessary in terms of education for this? Do you think it's necessary to have an educational background in writing to put together a book like this?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that if you are a competent storyteller, and by that, it also means you have to be organized enough to be able to structure your thoughts and structure a narrative in a way that is compelling to a reader. There's a reason that books are structured the way they are. There's a reason that they have sort of a kind of a rising arc and then a climax and then a denouement after. There are very reasonable motivations behind structuring a book like that. And so if you're organized enough to do that and can then spin a good yarn, it doesn't really matter if you are a grammarian at that point. I think there are enough resources out there, other people who can then take your very good yarn and polish it up into something that is ready for consumption out in the world. And I think that's that I would definitely encourage people who might be intimidated by the idea, well, I don't have a background in writing or English, or I've never tried this before. There's enough resources out there who can scrub what you've written to get it to a point where the average reader would say, hey, wow, this is really good stuff. It really is about the story. And I think that, for me, it was that compelling idea that I first saw when I was, helping our kids with their history projects, that like, wow, this is an amazing story. And so how can I tell this story? And so I think that if, for someone who's contemplating writing, that's really what matters, is can you convey this story in some fashion, even if someone else needs to polish it up to, figure out how best to tweak it. I think if you can get that yarn out there, someone else can help you with it.
All right. Well, then the next piece is your background. You have a very interesting background. Do you think that your background played into your ability to write this book?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up globetrotting around the world with my father's job, and so my childhood was spent in Europe and in Asia. I saw a lot of history and found a lot of inspiration in those historical places that are attached to historical events. I mean, it's one thing to read about the Battle of Hastings. It's another thing to stand on that hill and actually try to imagine what those two sides clashing would be, and the horses trampling bodies and all of that stuff. So that was certainly an immense inspiration to me. And then adding to that, my first career was in the intelligence defense world as a intelligence officer for the CIA. And much of what I did was military analysis. And so I then was able to look at the current geopolitical circumstance in the world from this analytical viewpoint. And part of my job was writing reports, was actually distilling what we were seeing into something that decision makers could then do something about. And so I think that was a big part of it. I certainly had the interest and the kind of motivation as a child, and then as an adult, I was thrown into this world and really was thriving. I really loved that job and was immersed in this sort of military analysis day in and day out for years. And so I think that it wasn't that much of a departure, really, even though that's, I've had a couple careers since then, since I left the agency. I still had that sort of analytical eye towards treating this material in a fashion that can really kind of explain what's going on.
How stressful was that role?
At times it was stressful. That was during there was a number of conflicts in the world. I mean, it was during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And so there were times where, things that we were doing on a day-to-day basis were a matter of life and death for people at home as well as people on the other side of the world. And so there were times where it was very stressful. It was an interesting time, and I really cherish my years there. I worked with some of the most amazing, talented, intelligent, patriotic people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with at the agency. And so, a great organization. And although, as I say, it was stressful, it was some of my most rewarding times I can recall working there, for sure.
What was a typical day like?
I don't know that there was a typical day. I think that because much of what we were working on, the teams that I was involved with, it was things that were happening in real time around the world. There wasn't much time to really sort of relax and reflect too much about it. We were trying to disseminate intelligence in as rapidly as possible to help save lives and protect the United States. And it was a very dynamic environment. I'll say it that way.
All right. I know you can't tell us any stories, but can you tell us what other types of things did you do in that role?
It was mostly trying to take information as it was coming in from whatever source it was coming in, and be able to turn that around and distill it and repackage it in a way that made sense in the context of whatever it was we were doing. If it was, in some cases, the United States was in direct military action with an enemy combatant. And so what we would do is provide that information, whether it was going to the Joint Chiefs of Staff or whomever it was going to, so that the decisions could be made using that intelligence as effectively as possible. Other times it was information about things where we weren't directly involved, but we had a vested interest in. What are our rivals doing in this part of the world, whatever it might be? And so it was mostly taking information and assembling it in such a way that it was easily digestible to someone else who can then make a decision with it. And so that was the goal, is to, and we would have to, collaborate and check with other resources and make sure that what we were doing was correct. The goal was always to find the truth, what's really going on, without any political bias, without any agenda, without any spin on it. Hey, these are the facts, and this is what we see, and this is what's going on. This is what we're hearing. This is what's going on, and this is what And so someone else can then decide what to do with that. But that was the idea: was to determine what is actually happening. What's the truth that's really going on?
Does that mean you work with a team of translators, or are you able to speak other languages?
I have only a smattering of other languages. I can speak passable German, partly because I went to school in Austria as a kid, and then subsequently took German in high school and college. And I, know some, tourist versions of other languages just to be able to get by. But no, there's a huge array of people in the intelligence community who have much more linguistic expertise than I do, who are able to do those types of things. So no, I did not have to do any translating myself.
All right. I'll let it go, sir. I'll let it go. Back to the book for a moment. Have you considered the idea of turning the book into a movie?
I think it lends itself well to a cinematic treatment. It would be amazing if that were. I think that I've had actually several comments from early readers of the book. It's only been out for a month. I've had several comments from people who say, "Wow, this would make an amazing movie." There's so many sort of extraordinary cinematic parts of this book that would be. So yes, I've thought about that. If people suggest that it would make a good video game, it really depends on your perspective, right? But yeah, it would be amazing if this could turn into a movie or miniseries or something like that. I think that it would lend itself well to that treatment.
You say video game, it's the eyes of a video game player, right? So just like the stories and the information you got, even the firsthand information, it's through the eyes of whoever's providing that information.
Exactly.
So, all right. So who would you want to be actors in the movie?
Wow. Well, the major players are all either British or German. And I think authenticity would demand that the actors have to be British or German. There are a number of extraordinary British actors that I think would do well in some of these roles. I'm trying to think, Dominic West, and I'm just trying to think who some of these folks would be. I know that on the German side, Christoph Waltz would be an amazing German, captain or admiral. So yeah, there are, I think, quite a few people that would be great fits for some of these characters in this book.
Any plans for the audiobook?
Possibly. I mean, the audiobook process is a little different. It requires, it's almost like, you have to essentially hire a studio and voice either actors or narrators to do this kind of a thing. And so I haven't yet gone down that route, but that would be a fun exercise to actually go through. And so I have had people ask me about it because there's, some people, that's how they consume their books. They've got a long commute and they want to listen to it. They don't have time to read it. They can't just sit there and read while they're driving to work to and from. So that would be a nice way to, kind of add to the options for this book. So that's a future state, but we'll get there.
That's definitely how I consume books. And
oh yeah,
sir, just point out, audio engineer right here. But my first job in audio engineering out of school was working at a recording studio in Boston during the day, recording books on tape. So I would do that during the day, and I record rock bands at night. But sometimes it's very boring. We do this thing here that we call Unsung Heroes, where we take a moment to shine the light on somebody who works behind the scenes, somebody who may have supported you along the way. Do you have anybody that you would like to shine a little light on?
Oh, it has to be my wife because
because you're a smart man.
Oh yeah, no, it's the same person who was just nearly apoplectic when I was spending the bigger chunk of my day writing a book than looking for a job. That's the same person who throughout this entire time has supported me. She has read all of the versions of this book, even the giant, horrible, early, drafts of it. And she definitely has been my biggest supporter. And so a shout out to Diane, who has been the rock and kept me going, certainly when I was discouraged and dealing with the constant drumbeat of rejection, that she kept me motivated and pushing forward.
A big thanks to Bob for taking the time to share his stories with us. And thank you for taking the time to hang with me here. I really do appreciate it. Please be sure to take the time to share this episode with a friend. You can do that and find the links to everything mentioned over at jfranzi.com/episode 70. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to The Jay Franzi Show. Make sure you visit us at jfranzi.com. Follow, connect, and say hello. This episode has been brought to you by VR Knives. your source for 100% custom knives made by a true rock star. So, if you're in the market for a new piece of art, reach out to VR Knives. 407-421-5528. 407-421-5528.